Welcome to our deep dive into Diplomacy and International Relations by Bastian Freiburg.
This one's a little different. It's been AI generated, but don't worry, Bastian Freiburg himself has checked every single fact.
Yep, cutting-edge tech meets good old-fashioned fact-checking to bring you some really fascinating insights from the world of diplomacy.
Exactly. And get this, we're not just talking about presidents and prime ministers, the usual suspects. We're going to see how cities, religion, even cartoons can have a surprisingly big impact on that global stage.
It really is about understanding all the different aspects of diplomacy in the 21st century. I think you'll be surprised by how many players are actually involved and the influence that they wield.
Okay, so let's untack this multi-layered world of diplomacy. One concept that really stood out to me is paradiplomacy. It kind of challenges that traditional idea that international relations is just countries talking to each other.
Right. Paradiplomacy really highlights that regions, cities, provinces, uh, they're all forging their own paths on the global stage, representing their specific interests. The source material defines city diplomacy as the institutions and processes by which cities engage in relations with actors on an international political stage with the aim of representing themselves and their interests to one another. So it's like cities are becoming diplomats in their own right.
Exactly. And one of the most fascinating examples of this multi-layered actorness, as it's called, is the Holy See.
The Vatican. But it's tiny.
That's what's so interesting about it. Despite its size, the Holy See has these formal diplomatic relations with countries all over the world.
So how do they pull that off?
Well, it's a few things. First, you have to consider the sheer global reach of the Catholic Church. I mean, that gives the Pope incredible influence as a transnational leader. And then there's the strategic use of Vatican City itself.
So it's not just about physical territory. It's about the influence and the soft power that the Vatican has.
Exactly. The Vatican's diplomatic power is deeply rooted in history, too. Think back to the Treaty of Tordesillas in 1494. Essentially, the Pope divided newly discovered lands between Spain and Portugal.
Wow, that's pretty powerful.
Even after the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648, which is often seen as the birth of the modern nation-state system, the Vatican continued to exert its diplomatic influence, especially through the work of the Jesuit order who acted as papal envoys all over the globe.
So the Vatican is a prime example of how paradiplomacy has been a force for centuries. Now, shifting gears to a more modern example of city diplomacy, the source material highlights the UCLG Decentralization and Local Self-Government Committee, which is led by the province of Barcelona.
This committee is a great example of how cities can band together to impact national and international policy. Their goal is to strengthen decentralization, giving more power to local governments.
So they're advocating for a greater role for cities and regions in the decision-making process.
Exactly. And they do this through different means, including lobbying national governments and international organizations, but also sharing best practices with other cities. One example is their Dialogues of Decentralization initiative. It brings local and national governments together to figure out the best ways to implement decentralization strategies.
That's a very proactive approach to influencing policy.
They were also key in creating the Ibero-American Charter of Local Self-Government. It's a document promoting decentralization throughout Latin America.
So what's the takeaway here? What does this tell us about diplomacy as a whole?
I think the case study of the UCLG clearly shows that local efforts can have ripple effects at the national and even global levels. Diplomacy is no longer just the domain of traditional state actors.
Hmm.
Cities are increasingly becoming key players in shaping the world around us.
It's fascinating how these different levels of diplomacy are interacting and influencing each other.
Absolutely. And you might not believe this, but even something as simple as a political cartoon can offer valuable insights into the world of diplomacy.
Wait, cartoons? You're saying cartoons can reveal something about international relations?
You might be surprised, especially when it comes to complex and sensitive topics like the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, for example. Analyzing political cartoons can be like a window into public opinion, and they can even help predict shifts in political dynamics.
Okay, now I'm intrigued. Tell me more about how that works.
Well, researchers analyzed over 1,200 Israeli and Palestinian cartoons that were published in the lead up to the Al-Aqsa Intifada, which started in late 2000. And what they found is that the cartoons showed a hardening of enemy images and a shift in focus towards violence and all this before the violence actually erupted.
So the cartoons were like a warning sign picking up on these underlying tensions and shifts in public sentiment.
In a way, yes. This type of analysis can be especially useful in countries with limited press freedom or censorship. Because cartoons can convey these messages through satire and symbolism, they can offer a more unfiltered view of what people are thinking, even if those thoughts are too risky to say out loud.
So it's like reading between the lines of diplomacy, using these cartoons to understand the undercurrents of a conflict.
Exactly. Now let's shift our focus to a specific country case study, Turkey. We're going to look at its foreign policy evolution, which is a story of a nation navigating a shift from a traditional realist approach to a more liberal stance in international affairs.
Turkey has always been such a fascinating case study in international relations. What's driving this shift in their foreign policy?
Well, historically, Turkish foreign policy was heavily influenced by realism, a strong focus on what we call power politics, all about balancing power with their neighbors, safeguarding their own independence, and navigating the security dilemma.
That's a classic realist approach, putting national security and self-interest above all else.
However, in recent decades, particularly under the Justice and Development Party, or AKP, Turkey has started to embrace a more liberal foreign policy. This shift really emphasizes cooperation, multilateralism, and engaging with a wider range of actors on the global stage.
So moving away from that us versus them mentality that's often associated with realism.
Precisely. We can see this shift in a number of initiatives. For example, Turkey's Zero Problems with Neighbors policy, which, as the name suggests, aim to improve relations with surrounding countries. We've also seen Turkey engaging more with Africa, Latin America, and the BRIC countries, Brazil, Russia, India, and China.
That's a pretty big departure from their traditional foreign policy stance. What's behind this change?
Well, it's a combination of internal and external factors. Domestically, political reforms and Turkey's bid to join the European Union have pushed them towards a more liberal approach. But at the same time, the global landscape has been changing a lot, especially after the Cold War. And events like the Arab Spring have forced Turkey to really rethink its role in the world.
So it's like they're trying to adapt to a world that's becoming more and more interconnected and complex.
Exactly. But as you can imagine, any major foreign policy shift like this comes with its own set of challenges.
What kind of obstacles are we talking about?
Well, for one thing, there's internal resistance. There are groups within Turkey that are still holding on to that more traditional realist worldview. The military, for instance, has historically played a powerful role in Turkish politics, and they've been hesitant to fully embrace this more liberal approach.
Yeah, I can see how that would create some tension internally. What about external challenges?
Well, externally, Turkey's evolving foreign policy has had to contend with some really complex situations. Things like the ongoing instability in the Middle East, the rise of new global powers like China, and the constant debates about Turkey's relationship with the West.
Sounds like a very delicate balancing act.
It certainly is. But despite all those challenges, Turkey's foreign policy transformation is a really interesting case study for how a nation can try to adapt and redefine itself on the global stage in a world that's constantly changing.
It's almost like they're rewriting their diplomatic playbook in real time. This deep dive has been incredibly insightful so far, and it feels like we've only just scratched the surface.
Welcome back to our deep dive into Diplomacy and International Relations by Bastian Freiborg. As we dig deeper into these concepts, it really becomes clear that diplomacy is way more complicated than we usually think.
Absolutely. We tend to think of diplomats in these fancy embassies, behind closed doors. But what we're seeing is that it's happening everywhere, even in ways we might not notice.
Exactly, and one of the key themes that keeps popping up is this idea of multi-layered actorness. It sounds kind of academic, I know, but what it means is that there are multiple levels of actors influencing international relations.
So it's not just about countries talking to each other anymore.
Right. It's cities, regions, international organizations, even religious institutions all playing a part on the global stage.
And, thinking back to what we talked about in the first part, the case of the Holy See is a great example of this. It reminds us that size doesn't really matter when it comes to diplomatic power.
Right. The Vatican's influence isn't about armies or economic power. It's about moral authority, their network of followers, and their use of soft power.
It's like they've mastered diplomacy without needing a huge army or a strong economy.
And what's amazing is that they've managed to navigate this changing world of international relations for centuries, adapting their strategies to stay relevant in a world that looks so different from even 100 years ago.
It makes you wonder what other unusual actors might be shaping the world order behind the scenes.
Speaking of unusual actors, let's go back to the idea of political cartoons and how we can use them to understand international relations. It's a really effective tool, especially when you're dealing with sensitive or complex topics.
I'm still kind of amazed by how much insight you can get from just looking at a cartoon. It's like they're holding up a mirror, showing our biases and our fears and our hopes.
Yeah, they can show us what people are really thinking, even when those thoughts are maybe too controversial to say openly. Remember that study we talked about with the Israeli and Palestinian cartoons before the Al-Aqsa Intifada?
Right, the one where the cartoons became more violent even before the actual fighting started.
Exactly. It's like they captured this feeling of frustration and anger that was bubbling under the surface, a feeling that you wouldn't necessarily see in the news or in diplomatic talks. Cartoons can give us a unique look into what a society is feeling, especially when people are afraid to speak freely.
It's like a secret language of diplomacy, using cartoons to communicate things that can't be said directly.
Now let's switch gears back to more traditional actors in diplomacy. Let's go back to Turkey's shift from a realist to a more liberal foreign policy. It's a story of a country trying to find its place in a world that's changing so quickly.
Turkey is an interesting case because it shows how internal and external pressures can force these changes in foreign policy. On one hand, you have domestic factors like political reforms and wanting to join Europe, which have pushed them toward a more liberal approach.
And on the other hand, you have external factors like the changing Middle East, the rise of new global powers, and the whole debate about Turkey's relationship with the West.
So it's like they're balancing their own internal goals with what's happening in this complex and often unpredictable world.
Exactly. And as you can imagine, this balancing act has not been easy. They've faced resistance both internally from those who prefer a more traditional view of foreign policy and externally from countries that are maybe a little suspicious of Turkey's growing power.
It seems like every time they try to move forward in their foreign policy, they hit a roadblock.
Yeah, that's often how it goes in diplomacy, especially when a country wants to change its role in the world. It's all about negotiating, compromising, and sometimes even taking a few steps back.
So it's not enough to just have a vision for your foreign policy. You also have to be able to handle all these relationships and interests in this really complicated international system.
Now, one idea that's particularly relevant to Turkey's situation is neo-Ottomanism.
I've heard that term, but I'm not really sure what it means.
It's a complicated idea with lots of different interpretations, but basically it's about Turkey trying to be more influential in the Middle East and even further afield, kind of drawing inspiration from their Ottoman past. Think of it less like they want to bring back the Ottoman Empire and more about tapping into that history of being a regional power.
So it's like showing that Turkey is a strong, independent player that can influence events in the region and maybe even beyond.
Exactly. But it's important to remember that not everyone in Turkey likes this idea of going back to the Ottoman past. It's a controversial topic.
Yeah, that makes sense. It must be hard to balance the idea of a modern democratic Turkey with this history of an empire that was often authoritarian and expansionist.
Absolutely. It's a debate that reflects some bigger tensions within Turkish society. Tensions between those who think Turkey's future is with the West and those who think they should be more independent, maybe embracing their Islamic heritage more.
It's like they're figuring out their identity on the world stage, trying to see where they fit in.
Precisely. And this internal struggle is playing out on the global stage as they try and navigate this complicated and rapidly changing world.
It's really interesting how history, identity, and geopolitics can come together to shape a nation's foreign policy. Now, speaking of case studies, our deep dive has brought us to another fascinating example of multi-layered actorness, the role of cities in shaping regional integration.
This takes us back to the idea of city diplomacy that we were talking about earlier.
Oh, right. We were talking about that UCLG committee in Barcelona and their focus on decentralization.
Yeah, that's a great example, but there's another case study worth exploring, the Mercosodades network in South America.
Mercosodades, what's that?
Mercosodades is a network of cities from the Mercosur countries, Argentina, Brazil, Paraguay, and Uruguay. It started in 1995, and their goal was to promote cooperation between these cities and boost regional integration in South America.
So like city diplomacy on a regional level.
Exactly. And what's interesting is that Mercosodades has gone from being a pretty informal group to a more established player within the Mercosur system.
So they're seen as a legitimate part of this regional integration process.
Right, and this highlights a bigger trend that we've been talking about throughout this deep dive, the growing influence of cities in shaping international relations.
It's like cities are becoming these diplomatic powerhouses.
Exactly. They're often dealing with things like trade, climate change, and migration, so it makes sense that they're more involved in international affairs, working together to find solutions that go beyond national borders.
This whole concept of multi-layered actorness
Yeah.
really makes you rethink who has power in international relations. It's not just about states anymore. It's about recognizing that these other actors have a role to play on the world stage.
Right. We're seeing a shift in power with non-state actors like cities, NGOs, and even individuals having more and more influence globally. This changes how we understand diplomacy and international relations in the 21st century.
It's like the lines between domestic and international politics are blurring. Local actions are having global consequences.
Mm.
Yeah, it really is amazing how much diplomacy is changing. We keep talking about how it's not just countries anymore, it's cities, international organizations, even cartoons. So how do traditional players like Denmark adapt to this new reality?
That's a big question. Denmark's always been a big supporter of multilateralism and working together internationally. But how do they navigate this world where these non-state actors have so much influence?
Right? Because it's one thing to have good relationships with other countries,
Yeah.
but how do you even do diplomacy with a city or a group of cities?
I think it takes a real change in thinking. Denmark has to realize that diplomacy isn't just about talking to other countries anymore. It's about engaging with all these different actors, cities, regions, those civil society groups we mentioned.
So it's about building connections and partnerships that go beyond just national governments.
Exactly. And I actually think Denmark is in a good spot to do this. They've got this strong tradition of local governance and a really active civil society. Those are big advantages in this new world of diplomacy.
So it's like they need to use their strengths at home to help them on the international stage.
Right. And they have to be smart about how they use their resources. They can't be everything to everyone. They need to focus on areas where they can make a real difference and where their interests match up with other actors, whether it's a city, an NGO, or another country.
So it's about picking the right partners, people who share their values and goals.
Yeah, and I think Denmark can learn a lot from countries like Turkey and Brazil that we've been talking about, countries that are already figuring out this multi-layered world of diplomacy.
It's like they need to keep adapting their diplomatic strategies to keep up with a world that's constantly changing.
Exactly. Diplomacy never stands still. It's always moving and changing. And Denmark needs to be flexible and responsive to stay ahead of the game.
This has been such a fascinating deep dive into Diplomacy and International Relations by Bastian Freiburg. We've gone beyond just thinking about diplomats in fancy rooms and explored all the different ways that diplomacy works in the 21st century. We've seen how cities are influential, how religion has power, even how cartoons can show us hidden tensions and what the public is feeling.
Yeah, we looked at some specific examples from the Vatican to Turkey to Brazil and got a better understanding of what's shaping international relations today.
And most importantly, we challenge those old ideas about diplomacy, recognizing the rise of what we've been calling multi-layered actorness, and this idea that power is spreading out on the global stage. So what does all this mean for you, the listener? Well, as you go about your day, think about all those invisible forces of diplomacy that are at work. Consider how cities are shaping our world. Think about the influence of those groups that aren't tied to governments. And remember that even something like soft power can have a big impact.
Diplomacy isn't just something that happens far away in capital cities. It's happening all around us all the time, often in ways we don't even realize. It's shaping our lives in big ways.
So stay curious, stay informed, and most importantly, stay engaged. The future of diplomacy depends on all of us.